Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Ready to tackle a topic that might sound a bit intimidating at first, but is actually super relevant to, like, all of us?
Absolutely. And it's one of those economic fundamentals that once you grasp it, can really unlock a deeper understanding of how the world works.
Exactly. So today, we're diving headfirst into the fascinating world of aggregate supply.
We'll break it down into those bite-sized pieces, making it clear and relatable for everyone.
Awesome, because honestly, sometimes those econ textbooks can feel a bit like trying to decipher a secret code, but understanding aggregate supply is like getting that decoder ring for the financial news, right? Suddenly you can see the patterns, the connections, the cause and effect.
You start to see those headlines in a whole new light, like why did prices go up so much last year, or why are some countries growing faster than others?
Exactly. And speaking of those price hikes, remember that crazy oil price shock back in 2022? That sent inflation soaring in so many countries.
It was definitely a pivotal moment that revealed just how interconnected those global markets really are, right? And how vulnerable we can be to those supply shocks.
Totally. Like, remember those painful trips to the gas station? Oof. Okay, so let's get down to brass tacks. What exactly is this mysterious thing called short-run aggregate supply? I mean, it sounds a bit technical. Can you help us break it down?
I think I can. Imagine a local bakery. When the smell of fresh pastries is in the air and people see those prices going up, what happens? More people line up to buy, right? That's demand rising. And what does the bakery do?
Bake more pastries to capitalize on that demand and, boost their profit.
Exactly. Short-run aggregate supply, or SRAS, is kind of like that bakery scenario, but on a much grander scale.
Yeah.
It's basically the total amount of all those goods and services that businesses in an economy are willing to produce, in the short term at different price levels.
Okay, that bakery analogy is super helpful. So as prices go up, businesses are like, let's make more stuff. Makes sense. But what about the things that can like miss with that upward sloping SRA's curve? Because it can't just be about businesses wanting to make more money.
Oh, there are tons of factors. Let's
Hmm.
talk about production costs for a second.
Mhm.
What happens if the price of raw materials suddenly spikes, like oil in 2022?
Ouch, yeah.
Oh,
Suddenly it costs way more to produce stuff.
right. So businesses might have to hit the pause button on production. It just becomes too expensive to keep churning out those goods and services at the same pace.
It's like those unexpected expenses that totally wreck your monthly budget, except this is like on a national scale, right? And those higher costs can actually nudge the entire SRA's curve to the left.
Hmm.
Not good. Now, what about the good stuff? What can shift that curve to the right?
Imagine the reverse scenario. What if raw materials get cheaper, or wages stabilize, or maybe there's a much-needed cut to those corporate taxes?
Suddenly, businesses have more breathing room. They can actually afford to like ramp up production and maybe even lower prices a bit. It's like getting a surprise bonus at work. You've got more options.
Exactly. Those cost savings for businesses translate into that rightward shift of the SRAS curve.
Okay, so more output at the same price level. That sounds pretty awesome, but are there any like hidden downsides we should be aware of?
A rightward shift generally signals good things, often lower inflation and those cost savings we
Mhm.
talked about. But, and this is important, if the curve shifts left, that's when we see cost push inflation, just like what happened after that oil price shock.
Right, because those higher production costs eventually get passed along to us, the consumers. It's like a chain reaction. Okay, let's shift gears now. We've been talking short term, but what about the long game? What's the story with long run aggregate supply?
Okay, so long-run aggregate supply, or LRAS, is all about an economy's maximum potential. Think of it like a factory operating at peak efficiency. Every machine is humming, every worker is engaged. That's the essence of LRAS. The total output an economy can crank out when all its resources are firing on all cylinders.
Got it. It's like an athlete performing at their absolute peak, pushing their limits. But wait, is there a single agreed upon way to think about LRAS? Or are there different perspectives on this?
You've hit a key point. It's not a one-size-fits-all concept. The classical view sees LRAS as a vertical line.
Mm.
Basically, they believe that in the grand scheme of things, an economy will always find its way back to full employment, regardless of what's happening with prices.
Interesting. So they see it as this sort of self-correcting mechanism, always returning to its full potential.
Exactly. But then you have the Keynesian view, which is a bit more nuanced. They acknowledge that things can get a bit sticky in the short run, especially with things like wages, meaning an economy might operate below its full potential for a while. They picture LRAS as like upward sloping and then becoming vertical.
So in the Keynesian view, it's not always a smooth journey to that peak performance state. There can be bumps along the way.
Okay, so what about the things that can shift LRAS? Is it the same stuff that impacts SRS?
LRAS is all about those big structural changes in an economy. Think long-term investments, not those short-term cost fluctuations we talked about earlier. For instance, pouring money into infrastructure, like China did during their economic boom, that can have a massive impact on LRAS, like building a bigger, more efficient factory, expanding the economy's productive capacity.
Gotcha. It's about those foundational elements that boost an economy's long-term potential.
Exactly. The same goes for things like improvements in education and skills. A more skilled workforce is a more productive workforce, right? They can simply produce more. And then you have technological advancements, those game changers that can revolutionize entire industries and supercharge productivity across the board. So it's all about investing in those things that boost an economy's long-term potential, shifting that LRAS curve to the right, expanding the possibilities. But what about the things that, pull it in the opposite direction? The things that shrink an economy's ability to produce?
Imagine a country experiencing a brain drain, where its brightest minds are packing their bags and heading for greener pastures. That's a loss of valuable human capital, a direct hit to LRAS.
Hmm.
Or picture a natural disaster like a massive earthquake that wipes out factories and infrastructure. That's a huge blow to an economy's productive capacity, shrinking that LRAS curve.
It's those events or trends that essentially damage the economy's ability to produce.
Right. And then there's the challenge of an aging population with fewer workers to, fuel that economic engine. These are all factors that can limit an economy's ability to produce those goods and services over the long haul.
Okay, I'm starting to see the bigger picture here. LRAS is about those foundational factors that shape an economy's potential, while SRAS is more about those short-term adjustments to price changes and cost fluctuations. But we're missing a key ingredient in all of this, right? Productivity.
You got it. We've talked about how much we produce, but how efficiently we do it is just as important. It's like, it's not just about working harder, it's about working smarter.
Let's unpack that, shall we? What exactly is productivity?
Productivity is about making the most of what we have. Imagine two workers in a factory. One can crank out 10 widgets per hour, while the other can only manage 5. That's a productivity gap.
So it's about how much output we can squeeze out of the same amount of input, like labor or resources. It's about doing more with less.
Precisely. And we measure it as output per unit of input.
Okay, but how does productivity tie back into this whole aggregate supply thing? I know they're connected, but I'm not quite seeing the full picture yet.
Think of it this way. If that worker, who is making 5 widgets, suddenly figures out a way to double his output, that's a productivity boost.
Okay, so he's found a more efficient way to work. Makes sense.
Now scale that up to a national level. When workers and businesses become more productive, we can create more output using the same amount of resources. And that increased efficiency often means lower costs for businesses, allowing them to produce even more. It's effectively shifting that aggregate supply curve to the right.
I see. So productivity is like a secret weapon that can turbocharge an economy's ability to produce. But what are some things that can boost productivity? I mean, in the real world, how do we get more of that magic?
Investing in technology is a big one. Think about robots on an assembly line, boosting efficiency and precision. And of course, there's education and training. Equipping people with the right skills and knowledge makes them more effective and adaptable in the workforce.
Makes perfect sense. Those investments definitely sound like they can boost productivity, but what about the things that, hold it back? Are there factors that can make us less efficient?
Unfortunately, yes. An aging workforce, for example, can sometimes lead to a decline in productivity. And if businesses are hesitant to invest in those new technologies or equipment, that can hinder productivity growth too. It's like trying to run a marathon in those old, worn-out shoes.
You might finish the race, but it's not going to be pretty or efficient.
Exactly. So investing in those things that boost productivity is like giving the economy a brand new pair of running shoes.
Okay, this is starting to make a lot of sense, but can you give us a real-world example of all of this in action, like a country that's known for its productivity?
Germany's manufacturing sector is a prime example. They've long been known for their precision engineering and efficient production processes. Their focus on automation and research and development has made them incredibly productive, allowing them to, churn out those high-quality goods at competitive prices.
Ah, yes, German engineering.
Yeah.
Legendary. But it's not just about machines and robots, is it? They've also invested heavily in their workforce, right?
Exactly. Germany has that strong apprenticeship system that provides workers with hands-on training and valuable skills. They've also fostered a close relationship between industry and academia, so research and innovation are closely tied to the needs of the economy.
So it's a holistic approach, blending cutting-edge tech with a highly skilled workforce, a winning combination. But I have to ask, is there a downside to all this aggregate supply growth? Could there be too much of a good thing?
That's a great question. And it highlights the importance of considering the bigger picture. Aggregate supply growth is generally seen as a positive force, but we do need to be mindful of those potential downsides too.
Okay, let's talk about those trade-offs. What are some of the potential downsides we need to consider?
One concern is that, as companies invest more in automation and technology to boost productivity, it can lead to structural unemployment. Some jobs might become obsolete as machines take over tasks previously done by humans.
Right, so we need to find ways to support those workers who might be displaced by those technological advancements.
Absolutely. It's about creating an economy that works for everyone. And beyond the impact on jobs, there's also the potential for environmental damage. Even if industrial activity becomes more efficient, it can still strain natural resources and contribute to pollution if it's not managed responsibly.
So we need to find that balance between economic growth and environmental sustainability.
Exactly. It's about finding that sweet spot.
Well, this has been an incredible journey so far. We've gone from those basic definitions to real-world examples, and I feel like I have a much deeper understanding of aggregate supply now.
I agree. I think we've laid a solid foundation for our listeners.
Absolutely. But there's much more to explore. We're going to continue our aggregate supply adventure in the next part of this deep dive.
We'll delve deeper into the relationship between aggregate supply and aggregate demand, explore how government policies can influence those aggregate supply curves, and analyze even more real-world examples of how changes in aggregate supply play out in different countries and industries.
So stay tuned. There's a whole lot more to uncover.
It's amazing how those seemingly small changes can, ripple through an entire economy.
It's true. It's all interconnected. Speaking of connections, I'm curious about the relationship between aggregate supply and productivity. I mean, we've talked about how productivity can impact aggregate supply, but can it work the other way around? Can changes in aggregate supply actually influence productivity?
It's definitely a two-way street, like a dynamic dance between those two forces.
Right.
Imagine a surge in aggregate supply. Maybe there's been a wave of technological innovation or a burst of investment in infrastructure.
Okay, so there's suddenly more stuff being produced.
Right. And that often leads to lower prices, which is great news for consumers, obviously. But here's where things get interesting. Those lower prices can actually benefit businesses too.
Wait, lower prices boosting businesses? How does that work?
Well, think about it. When prices drop, demand often goes up. People are more likely to buy when things are more affordable, right?
That makes sense.
So this surge in demand can lead to increased sales and production for businesses. And here's the key, that increased activity can actually create an incentive for those businesses to invest further in things like capital, technology, and worker training. They want to meet that growing demand and stay ahead of the competition.
Ah, I see. So it's like a virtuous cycle, right? Increased aggregate supply leads to lower prices, which boosts demand, encourages more investment, and ultimately leads to even more aggregate supply and productivity. It keeps that momentum going.
Precisely. It's a positive feedback loop that can really propel an economy forward. Businesses are motivated to innovate and become more efficient to keep up with that increased demand. Okay, now let's flip the script. Imagine a scenario where aggregate supply shrinks. Maybe there's a global supply chain disruption, a natural disaster, or some government policies that, throw a wrench in the works.
Okay, so now we're talking about a situation where it's harder for businesses to produce those goods and services. What happens next?
Well, when supply drops, we often see prices climb, right? And output shrinks. Remember those empty grocery store shelves during the early days of the pandemic? That was a real-world example of aggregate supply taking a hit.
Oh, yeah. That was definitely a strange and unsettling time. And it makes sense that when things become scarce, those prices tend to go up. But how does this impact productivity? Does it just, stall things out?
It can be a bit more insidious than that. When businesses are dealing with higher costs and reduced output, it can squeeze their ability to invest in those productivity-enhancing measures we talked about earlier. They might have to, postpone those equipment upgrades or cut back on research and development. It's like trying to run a race with an injured ankle.
Ouch. Yeah, you might finish the race, but it's going to be a lot slower and more painful.
Exactly. It's not just a pause. It can actually set things back. It's like a negative feedback loop.
Hmm.
Decreased aggregate supply leads to those higher prices, reduces output, which then discourages investment, and ultimately hinders productivity growth.
Got it. It's like a downward spiral. Okay, so we've seen how changes in aggregate supply can influence productivity. But I'm curious about the role of government policies in all of this. I mean, we've talked about how things like taxes and regulations can impact businesses, but can those policies actually shift the aggregate supply curve itself?
Absolutely. Governments can play a pretty powerful role in shaping aggregate supply, both in the short run and the long run. It's all about how those policies impact those business costs, incentives, and their overall capacity to produce.
Okay, let's get specific. Can you give us some concrete examples of policies that can impact aggregate supply?
Sure. Think about tax cuts for businesses. By reducing their tax burden, those businesses suddenly have more capital to invest, right? Maybe they expand their operations, hire more workers, or upgrade their equipment. All those things can boost aggregate supply.
So, tax cuts can be like a shot in the arm for businesses, giving them a boost to ramp up production and maybe even lower prices for consumers.
Exactly. Another example is deregulation. Now, I know regulations are important. They protect consumers and the environment. But sometimes those regulations, while well-intentioned, can become burdensome and like stifle innovation. Streamlining those regulations can free up resources for businesses and encourage them to, invest in those new products and services.
So, it's about finding that right balance, regulations that protect people and the planet, but don't create unnecessary hurdles for businesses.
Exactly. It's about creating that business-friendly environment that fosters growth and innovation.
Mm.
But it's not just about removing obstacles. Governments can also play a more proactive role by directly investing in those areas that support that long-term aggregate supply growth.
Like what? I'm imagining those big infrastructure projects, roads, bridges, that kind of thing.
You got it. Think about those infrastructure projects, roads, bridges, airports, high-speed rail lines, energy grids. These investments create jobs in the short term, but also lay the groundwork for long-term economic growth. They reduce transportation costs, improve efficiency, and connect businesses to new markets.
So, it's like investing in the arteries of the economy. Makes sense.
Right. And then there are those investments in education and training. A highly skilled workforce is essential for innovation and productivity growth. So governments can play a vital role in making sure workers have those skills and knowledge they need to thrive in a rapidly changing economy.
It's about investing in human capital, recognizing that people are the engine of economic growth.
Exactly. A more educated and adaptable workforce can drive those innovations, boost productivity, and really push an economy forward. And one more area where government policies can have a big impact is trade policy.
Ah, yes. Trade. It's a hot topic these days.
Right?
How does trade policy fit into this whole aggregate supply puzzle?
Trade policies can influence the flow of goods and services across borders, which can have a big impact on aggregate supply. Policies that promote free trade, like reducing tariffs and those trade barriers, can lead to increased competition, lower prices for consumers, and access to a wider variety of goods and services.
So free trade can boost aggregate supply by like opening up those global markets.
Exactly. But it's also important to acknowledge that trade policies can have those distributional effects within an economy. Some industries and workers might face increased competition from those imports, which could lead to job losses or wage stagnation.
Right. So while free trade can boost an economy overall, it's important to consider those potential impacts on specific groups of workers and industries. We need to make sure everyone benefits.
Absolutely. It's about creating a more inclusive and equitable globalization process.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've seen how government policies can be a real lever for influencing aggregate supply, whether it's through those tax cuts, deregulation, investing in infrastructure and education, or trade policies. It's this complex interplay between government actions and those forces of supply and demand.
It's a lot to keep track of, but it sounds like finding that right balance is super important for a healthy economy. Now, I want to zoom out for a moment and look at the big picture. We've been deep diving into aggregate supply, but how does it interact with aggregate demand? Like, how do they work together to determine the overall health and stability of an economy?
That's the big question in macroeconomics, right? Aggregate demand represents the total demand for all those goods and services in an economy at a given price level. It's the combined spending power of households, businesses, the government, and foreign buyers.
Got it. So it's basically the total spending engine of an economy.
Right. And just like aggregate supply, aggregate demand can be represented by a curve showing that relationship between the price level and the quantity of goods and services demanded.
Okay, and I'm guessing that curve can also shift based on different
You
factors.
got it. Things like changes in consumer confidence, government spending, interest rates, exchange rates, all those things can nudge that aggregate demand curve. If consumers are feeling good about the future, they're more likely to spend, shifting that curve to the right. But if they're feeling anxious and uncertain, they might hold back, causing the curve to shift left.
So it's a bit like a seesaw between those two forces. When they're balanced, the economy is usually humming along pretty smoothly.
That's a good analogy. When those two forces are in equilibrium, it means the quantity of goods and services supplied matches the quantity demanded at that prevailing price level. It's a state of balance. Businesses are selling what they're producing, and consumers are finding what they want at prices they're willing to pay.
So it's like the Goldilocks zone. Everything is just right. But what happens when things get out of whack? What are some of the potential scenarios we might see?
Imagine a sudden drop in aggregate demand. Maybe there's a global economic slowdown, a stock market crash that shakes consumer confidence, or, a pandemic that forces businesses to close and consumers to stay home.
Okay, demand takes a nosedive. What happens to the economy?
Well, when aggregate demand falls, businesses often find themselves with those untold goods and services piling up. That can lead to downward pressure on prices as they try to clear out that inventory. And to adjust, they might have to cut back on production, lay off workers, or reduce investments, which can, further dampen economic activity.
So it can trigger a downward spiral. Less demand leads to less production, job losses, which further reduces demand, and so on.
Exactly. It can be tough to break out of that cycle. Now, on the flip side, if aggregate demand suddenly surges, way beyond the economy's ability to produce, that can lead to a different problem.
Demand pull inflation.
Demand pull inflation.
Okay, break that down for me.
It's basically when there's too much money chasing too few goods. When demand exceeds supply, it pushes those prices upward as consumers compete for those limited resources. Think about those crazy bidding wars we sometimes see in housing markets.
Yeah, when everyone wants a piece of the pie, but the pie isn't getting any bigger, those prices are going to go up. Makes sense.
Right, and this can lead to a spiral of rising prices. Businesses see that increased demand and raise their prices, which can then fuel even more inflation as consumers try to keep up.
So it seems like keeping those two forces in balance, aggregate supply and aggregate demand, is super important for maintaining a stable economy.
Absolutely. It's a constant balancing act. Policymakers often use those monetary and fiscal policies to try to manage aggregate demand and keep the economy on track. Things like adjusting interest rates, government spending, and taxes to influence those spending patterns and smooth out those economic fluctuations.
Okay, so it's like a constant juggling act requiring careful coordination and a deep understanding of how those two forces interact. But enough with the theory. I'm eager to explore some real-world examples of how changes in aggregate supply have actually played out in different countries and industries. Let's zoom in on China first. They've experienced an incredible economic transformation over the past few decades. But more recently, they've been facing some headwinds. What are some of the key factors that have been driving those shifts in aggregate supply in China?
China's economic rise has been phenomenal. They've gone from a relatively closed economy to a global manufacturing powerhouse in just a few decades. One of the key factors driving their initial surge in aggregate supply was their shift from a centrally planned economy to a more market-oriented system.
So they basically embraced those free market principles.
Exactly. This unlocked a ton of productive potential. Suddenly, businesses were free to respond to those market signals, to innovate and to compete. Foreign investment poured in, bringing capital, technology, and know-how.
And I'm guessing those massive infrastructure investments played a big role too. I've seen those incredible pictures of their high-speed rail network and those modern cities springing up seemingly overnight.
Absolutely. Infrastructure is the backbone of a productive economy. China invested heavily in those transportation networks, energy systems, and communication technology. All of those things helped lower costs, improve efficiency, and connect those businesses to new markets.
So they were laying the groundwork for a more connected and efficient economy.
Precisely. Another crucial factor was the demographic dividend. China had this large and relatively young workforce, which provided a plentiful supply of labor.
Right, that makes sense. A young, growing workforce can fuel economic growth.
Absolutely. And China capitalized on this by investing in education and training, improving the skills of its workforce. They recognized that human capital is just as important as physical capital.
So it was this perfect storm of factors, those market reforms, infrastructure investments, a favorable demographic landscape, and strategic investments in education and training. All of those ingredients came together to create that remarkable surge in aggregate supply, propelling China to become the world's second largest economy.
Exactly. It really is a testament to the power of sound economic policies. But in recent years, as you mentioned, China has been facing some new challenges that are putting some downward pressure on their aggregate supply.
Let's talk about those challenges. What are some of the factors that have been slowing down China's economic engine?
One major challenge has been those rising labor costs. As China's economy has matured, wages have increased, which has, eroded some of their cost advantages in manufacturing. They're not the low-cost labor haven they once were.
So the competition is heating up. Other countries are entering that global manufacturing game, and China's facing stiffer competition.
Exactly. And another challenge is the aging of their population. That one-child policy, which was in place for several decades, has led to a shrinking workforce and an increasing proportion of elderly dependents.
Right, so that demographic shift is creating new challenges for them.
It is. And on top of those demographic shifts, China is also dealing with the fallout from that trade war with the United States.
Ah, yes, the trade war. Those tariffs and trade barriers have definitely created a lot of uncertainty in the global economy. How has that impacted China's aggregate supply?
It's disrupted those supply chains, increased costs for businesses, and dampened investment. It's made it tougher for Chinese companies to access those global markets and for foreign companies to do business in China.
So it's added friction to that global trading system, making it harder for those goods and services to flow freely.
Exactly. And in addition to these economic challenges, China's also facing those environmental constraints. Their rapid industrialization has come at a cost to the environment. They're grappling with issues like air and water pollution, which can impact public health and productivity.
So they're realizing that unfettered growth can have some unintended consequences.
Right. And it's a trade-off that many countries are dealing with.
So China's story is evolving. They're facing a complex set of challenges, but they're also adapting, right? Trying to shift their economic model towards a more balanced approach.
Absolutely. They're investing in areas like renewable energy, artificial intelligence, and biotechnology, trying to move up that value chain.
It'll be fascinating to see how those efforts play out. China's economic transformation is a story that the whole world is watching. Okay, let's zoom out from China for a moment and look at another example of how changes in aggregate supply have reshaped an industry. How about the energy sector? It's been undergoing a pretty dramatic transformation in recent years with that rise of renewable energy.
The energy sector is a great example of how technological innovation can disrupt an industry and shift those aggregate supply curves. The adoption of renewable energy sources, like solar and wind power, has really shaken things up.
So it's like we're diversifying our energy portfolio, moving away from fossil fuels and embracing those cleaner, more sustainable sources.
Exactly. And as the technology for renewable energy has advanced, those production costs have plummeted. Solar panels and wind turbines are becoming more affordable, making renewable energy more competitive with those traditional fossil fuels.
So it's a win-win, right? More energy from cleaner sources and at lower costs. That sounds like a game changer.
It is. This shift has pushed that aggregate supply curve for energy to the right. We're seeing more energy supplied at a given price.
So we're seeing a fundamental shift in that energy landscape, but the energy market is complex, right? There are a lot of moving parts. I imagine there are other factors at play, like government policies, those geopolitical events, and just the basic dynamics of supply and demand.
Absolutely. The energy market is definitely influenced by a lot of interconnected factors. Government policies, like subsidies for renewable energy or carbon taxes on fossil fuels, can play a big role in shaping that energy mix. And then there are geopolitical events, like those conflicts in oil-producing regions. Those events can send shockwaves through energy markets, impacting those prices and supply. And of course, you have the dynamics of supply and demand, which are always in flux.
So while the rise of renewable energy is a major force, the energy market is this dynamic and evolving landscape shaped by all these factors.
Precisely. It's a fascinating case study, and it highlights that importance of adaptability and resilience.
Well said. Before we move on, I want to touch on another aspect of aggregate supply that's super relevant in today's globalized economy: global supply chains. How do they factor into the aggregate supply equation?
Global supply chains are those intricate networks that connect businesses across borders, allowing them to source goods and services from around the world. They've become really complex in recent decades.
Right. It's like a global assembly line with different
Mhm.
parts of the production process happening in different parts of the world.
Exactly. And this has led to remarkable efficiency gains and lower costs for businesses. It's enabled companies to produce goods more cost effectively and offer consumers a wider variety of products at more affordable prices.
So they've been a major driver of aggregate supply growth. But I'm guessing there are also some risks involved in relying on these sprawling networks.
One major risk is disruption. Global supply chains are vulnerable to a ton of things. Natural disasters, political instability, pandemics, cyber attacks. We saw this play out during the COVID-19 pandemic, right?
Oh, yeah. The pandemic exposed how fragile those intricate networks can be.
Exactly. Those disruptions can have a significant impact on aggregate supply, disrupting production, increasing costs, and leading to shortages of those essential goods and services.
Right, like those empty shelves we saw in the grocery stores.
Right.
So it's a trade-off. Global supply chains offer efficiency and cost savings, but they also come with that increased vulnerability.
Exactly. And it highlights the need to build more resilient supply chains that can weather those storms. Diversifying those suppliers, building in redundancies, and just being prepared for the unexpected are all crucial.
Okay, so we've explored those factors that influence aggregate supply, the role of productivity, the impact of government policies, those global supply chains, and how it all interacts with aggregate demand. But there's a bigger question here that I want to explore. What does aggregate supply really mean for individuals and societies?
That's a great question. It goes beyond the graphs and the data, right?
Exactly. I mean, at its core, aggregate supply represents an economy's productive capacity, right?
Yeah.
Its ability to create those goods and services that meet people's needs and wants. And ultimately, that productive capacity determines our standard of living, the quality of our lives, and the opportunities we have. It shapes our access to education, healthcare, housing, all those things.
It's about those resources we have, the technologies we develop, the skills we acquire, and the choices we make. Our collective capacity to create value, to solve those problems, to improve our lives.
It's a reminder that economics isn't just about numbers, it's about people.
It is. And understanding these forces is crucial for creating a more prosperous, equitable, and sustainable future.
Well said. Okay, I want to shift gears again and look at some more real-world examples of how these changes in aggregate supply have played out in specific industries.
Sounds good. Let's dive in.
Let's start with an industry that's seen a surge in aggregate supply thanks to technological innovation, the tech sector. It's an industry that's constantly pushing those boundaries, creating new products at a dizzying pace.
The tech sector is a prime example of how innovation can drive that aggregate supply growth and reshape those entire industries.
Yeah.
Think about the smartphones we carry around, right?
Yeah.
They're more powerful than the computers that sent us to the moon.
It's mind-blowing.
It is. And this pace of innovation has led to a surge in aggregate supply in the tech sector. New products are hitting the market constantly, driving down prices and offering more choices.
It's like a never-ending stream of new gadgets and apps.
It is. And that competition is driving innovation and efficiency. Companies are constantly trying to create that next big thing.
So it's that cycle again. Innovation leads to more supply, lower prices, and even more innovation.
Exactly. And this dynamic is transforming a ton of industries that are embracing those digital technologies.
Can you give us some examples of how technology is spilling over into other industries and boosting that aggregate supply?
Absolutely. Think about retail. E-commerce platforms like Amazon have changed everything, offering those vast selections at competitive prices delivered right to your door.
It's so convenient.
It is. And this shift towards e-commerce has increased that competition in the retail sector. Traditional stores have had to become more efficient and offer those more competitive prices to keep up.
So it's like a rising tide that lifts all boats, right? That innovation in one sector spills over into others.
Exactly. And another good example is transportation. Ride-sharing services like Uber and Lyft have disrupted that traditional taxi industry, giving people more convenient and often cheaper options.
Oh, yeah, I use those apps all the time.
They've also created new opportunities for people to earn income as drivers, increasing that supply of labor.
So it's not just about the technology itself, it's about how that technology changes the way we live and work.
Absolutely. Okay, now we've talked about the positive side, but let's address that potential downside too. We mentioned structural unemployment as a possible consequence of automation earlier. Is that a concern in this sector as well?
It's a valid concern. As AI and automation become more sophisticated, there's definitely a risk that some jobs, especially those involving those repetitive tasks, could be automated, and that could lead to job displacement.
Right. So while innovation can be a great thing for aggregate supply, we need to be mindful of those potential impacts on the workforce.
It's about making sure everyone benefits from those advancements. Okay, let's shift gears one last time and explore an industry where those changes in aggregate supply have been driven by different factors. How about agriculture? It's an industry that's like essential to human survival, but it's also facing a ton of challenges: climate change, population growth, resource scarcity. What are some of those key trends shaping aggregate supply in this sector?
Agriculture is a really interesting case study. It's the foundation of our food supply, but it's also deeply connected to the environment, climate change, and global trade.
It's like that original source of aggregate supply, right?
Exactly. But as you mentioned, the agricultural sector is facing a lot of challenges. Climate change is a big one. Those changes in temperature, rainfall patterns, those extreme weather events, they're all disrupting agricultural production.
Yeah, we've seen those images of droughts and floods impacting those farmlands.
And these disruptions are putting downward pressure on aggregate supply. Crops are failing, livestock are dying, and food prices are going up.
So we're talking about potential food shortages and rising prices. That's scary.
It's a real concern. It highlights the need to address climate change and build more resilient agricultural systems.
Absolutely. What about population growth? How is that impacting things?
As the global population keeps growing, the demand for food is increasing. This puts pressure on those farmers to produce more food to feed all those extra mouths.
So it's a race to keep up.
Right. And this is compounded by resource scarcity, water scarcity, land degradation, the depletion of soil nutrients. These are all constraints on production.
So it's not just about producing more food, it's about producing it sustainably.
Exactly. Finding those ways to increase productivity while protecting the planet is crucial.
It's a huge challenge.
It is. It's going to require a lot of innovation and a commitment to sustainable practices.
Okay, so we've explored the forces that shape aggregate supply, the role of productivity, the impact of government policies, those global supply chains, the challenges facing those key industries, and how it all interacts with aggregate demand. But I want to end this part by circling back to something you said earlier: human potential being the ultimate driver of aggregate supply. Can you elaborate on that a bit more?
Absolutely. I think it's so important to remember that at the end of the day, aggregate supply is really about human potential. It's about our capacity to innovate, to solve problems, to create that value. It's about our ability to imagine new possibilities, to develop those new technologies, to find new ways to produce those goods and services more efficiently and sustainably.
Right. It's about that spark of creativity that drives progress.
Exactly. Think about all those incredible advancements we see in the internet, for example. All those breakthroughs were driven by that human desire to improve our lives.
It's a reminder that aggregate supply isn't just about numbers, it's about the human spirit.
It is. And that spirit ultimately determines the limits of what we can achieve. It's about creating an environment where creativity can flourish, where people are encouraged to think differently and to pursue their passions.
It's about building a society that values knowledge, creativity, and entrepreneurship.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that human ingenuity is our greatest resource.
Well said. I think that's a perfect segue to the final part of our deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground. Now let's wrap it all up and leave our listeners with some key takeaways. Welcome back to the deep dive. In this final part, we're going to distill everything we've learned about aggregate supply and hopefully leave you with some food for thought.
It's been quite a journey through the world of economics, hasn't it?
It really has. We've gone from those basic definitions of SRAs and LRAs to real-world examples of how aggregate supply is playing out in different countries and industries.
And we've seen how it interacts with aggregate demand, shaping everything from prices to employment.
Exactly. And we've touched on the crucial role of productivity, the impact of those government policies, and even the human element of innovation and entrepreneurship.
We've seen how interconnected everything is, how a disruption in one part of the world can ripple through those global supply chains and affect everyone.
It's a complex landscape for sure, but I think we've given our listeners the tools to understand it better.
I agree. Now, before we wrap up, I'd love to circle back to something we talked about earlier, that idea of human potential being that ultimate driver of aggregate supply.
Yes, it's such a powerful concept, and it's often overlooked in those traditional economic discussions.
Right. It's not just about factories and machines. It's about people, their creativity, their ingenuity.
It's about our ability to come up with new solutions to those problems and to create things that benefit everyone.
Think about the internet. It's completely revolutionized the way we live and work, and it all started with human ingenuity.
And now it's fueling a wave of innovation in so many fields like artificial intelligence, biotechnology, renewable energy. It's incredible.
It really is.
Yeah.
But we have to remember, technology is just a tool. The real goal is to use it to create a better future for everyone.
So it's not just about the tech itself, it's about how we use it to solve those real-world problems.
Exactly. And that takes more than just technical skills. We need to invest in education, foster a culture of innovation, and create a society that values creativity and collaboration.
We need to empower people to reach their full potential. Basically, we need to create an environment where those sparks of ingenuity can turn into real positive change.
Well said. Aggregate supply isn't just an economic concept. It's a reflection of our shared human potential.
And I think that's a perfect takeaway for our listeners. Aggregate supply is a testament to our ability to create, to innovate, to build a better future.
And it's a journey that never ends. There will always be new challenges and new opportunities.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into aggregate supply, I want to leave our listeners with a call to action. Let's embrace those challenges, seize those opportunities, and create a world where aggregate supply reflects our shared humanity and our potential to create a brighter future.
A world where prosperity is shared, innovation flourishes, and sustainability is at the core of everything we do.
Well said. A huge thank you to our expert guest for joining us today and sharing your insights on this fascinating topic.
It was my pleasure.
And to our amazing listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of aggregate supply. We hope you learned something new and maybe even feel inspired to think differently about the economy and its impact on our lives. Keep those minds curious and keep diving deep.
Until next time.
See you all next time.